On August 19, 1942, in the dense jungle near Taivu Point on Guadalcanal, 2nd Lieutenant Jinjiro Imai of the 8th Independent Anti-Tank Gun Company recorded observations in his diary that captured the profound shock many Japanese soldiers felt upon first encountering American forces. Through the thick canopy of palm trees and strangling vines, Imai and 916 other soldiers of Colonel Kaineo Ichiki's detachment had just landed from destroyers, completing a nighttime insertion that Japanese command believed would be the first crucial step toward recapturing Henderson Field. They had been told the Americans numbered perhaps 2,000 men, poorly trained, easily frightened, and soft from lives of luxury. Colonel Ichiki himself had dismissed warnings to wait for reinforcements. "These are Americans," he confidently told his officers. "We will sweep them into the sea before sunrise." What none of these battle-hardened veterans of China and Southeast Asia knew was that they were about to encounter something completely unprecedented in the annals of the Imperial Japanese Army. It was not merely defeat, which was itself unthinkable for soldiers who had known nothing but victory since 1937, but a systematic demolition of every single tactical assumption, every strategic concept, and every ideological certainty that defined the Japanese way of war. The jungle itself would become an American weapon. The darkness that Japanese forces had owned since the very beginning of the war would betray them, and the overwhelming superiority in equipment, coordination, and sheer destructive capability would shatter the myth of Japanese invincibility in close combat. This transformation had begun 2 weeks earlier, on August 7th, when 11,000 United States Marines of the 1st Marine Division stormed ashore at Lunga Point. General Alexander Vandegrift's Leathernecks were executing Operation Watchtower, the very first American offensive operation of the Pacific War. Their objective seemed straightforward on paper: seize the nearly completed Japanese airfield, establish a defensive perimeter, and hold the position until relieved. In reality, they were about to fight the longest, most brutal campaign in Marine Corps history up to that point, in an environment that would test human endurance to its absolute limits. The island itself was a vision of tropical hell. Guadalcanal stretched 90 miles long and 25 miles wide, its interior dominated by mountains that reached 8,000 feet into perpetual clouds. The coastal plain where Henderson Field sat was a strip of kunai grass, swamp, and jungle so thick that visibility dropped to mere feet. The heat was suffocating, and the humidity never dropped below 90%. Mosquitoes swarmed in clouds so dense that men would literally inhale them. The rivers and streams that looked clear and inviting on reconnaissance photographs teemed with parasites and disease. Malaria, dengue fever, dysentery, and tropical ulcers would eventually disable more men than enemy action. But on that first morning, the Marines found the airfield almost completely undefended. The 2,200 Japanese construction workers and 600 naval troops fled into the jungle, abandoning their equipment, supplies, and most critically, the airfield itself. By nightfall on August 8th, American engineers were already working to complete the runway. They would name it Henderson Field, after Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine aviator who had been killed at Midway. Within days, the first aircraft would land, and the island would become home to what history would forever remember as the Cactus Air Force. The Japanese response was swift and catastrophic for American naval forces. On the night of August 9th, Vice Admiral Genichi Mikawa led 7 cruisers and 1 destroyer through the darkness in a brilliant surprise attack. The Battle of Savo Island became the worst defeat in United States Navy history. For heavy cruisers, the USS Quincy, the USS Vincennes, the USS Astoria, and HMS Canberra were sent to the bottom of the sea in less than an hour. More than 1,000 sailors died in the flaming waters. The surviving Allied naval forces withdrew, taking with them most of the supplies that had not yet been unloaded. The Marines were stranded, cut off, and facing a reinforced enemy with barely half their equipment and food. What the Japanese High Command failed to grasp in those early August days was that Henderson Field had become the key to everything. Control of the airfield meant control of the surrounding seas during daylight hours. Aircraft operating from Henderson could strike any Japanese ship within a 200-mile radius. This single fact would dictate the entire nature of the campaign. The Japanese could own the night, sending in troops and supplies aboard fast destroyers in runs that became known as the Tokyo Express. But when dawn broke, American aircraft ruled the skies. The strategic situation demanded that Japan retake Henderson Field immediately, before the Americans could fortify their position. Imperial General Headquarters assigned the task to Lieutenant General Harakichi Hyakutake's 17th Army, based at Rabaul. Hyakutake had only limited forces available. The 35th Infantry Brigade under Major General Kayotake Kawaguchi was at Palau. The 4th Infantry Regiment was in the Philippines. The closest unit was Colonel Ichiki's 28th Infantry Regiment, which had been stationed near Guam, originally intended for the Midway operation that had been cancelled after the naval disaster in June. Colonel Kaineo Ichiki was an infantry school instructor with a reputation as a first-rate tactician. He was also known for being impulsive and having a supreme confidence in Japanese fighting spirit over American material strength. Before departing truck for Guadalcanal, Ichiki received clear orders to wait for the rest of his regiment before attempting to retake the airfield. But Ichiki had very little respect for American soldiers. He had studied reports from China, from the Philippines, and from everywhere Japanese forces had encountered Western troops. They lacked discipline. They broke under pressure. They could not match Japanese warriors in close combat. On the night of August 18th, 6 destroyers delivered 917 men of Ichiki's first element to Taivu Point, 15 miles east of the American perimeter. The landing went smoothly and was undetected by American forces. Ichiki immediately sent out reconnaissance patrols to assess enemy strength and defensive positions. It was a routine tactical decision that would prove to be fatal. On August 19th, a patrol from Company A, 1st Battalion, 1st Marines under Captain Charles Brush, was moving along the coastal track toward Coley Point when they spotted Japanese soldiers. The two forces collided in a brief, vicious firefight. The Marines killed 31 Japanese soldiers and captured documents that revealed the presence of a significant enemy force in the area. More importantly, the captured papers showed that the Japanese severely underestimated American strength. Captain Brush raced back to the perimeter with his intelligence haul. General Vandegrift immediately understood what was coming. A Japanese attack, soon, and probably from the east. He ordered Colonel Clifton Cates to strengthen the defenses along the sandbar at the mouth of what the Marines called the Tenaru River. It was actually the Ilu River, but the misidentification would stick in all subsequent accounts. Cates deployed Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Cresswell's 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines, along the riverbank, with machine guns positioned to create interlocking fields of fire across the sandbar. What happened next would become one of the most one-sided battles in Marine Corps history. Colonel Ichiki, rather than waiting for intelligence from his lost patrol or for reinforcements, decided to attack immediately. On the night of August 20th into the early morning of August 21st, he ordered a frontal assault directly across the sandbar. Japanese doctrine emphasized the superiority of spiritual power and aggressive night attacks to overcome enemy firepower. Ichiki believed his veterans could break through the American defenses through sheer audacity and close-quarters fighting, where Japanese soldiers excelled with bayonets and grenades. Just after midnight, a Solomon Island scout named Jacob Vuza, who had escaped Japanese captors after hours of torture, stumbled into Marine lines with a warning. The Japanese were coming. Minutes later, the attack began. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers charged across the sandbar, screaming battle cries, firing their rifles, and hurling grenades. They ran directly into a killing zone that the Marines had prepared with methodical precision. The M1917A1 Browning water-cooled machine guns opened fire. These weapons, perfected during World War I, were the unsung heroes of Marine firepower. Each gun could sustain 600 rounds per minute indefinitely, as long as the water jacket stayed filled. The Marines had positioned them in mutually supporting positions so that no area of the sandbar remained uncovered. Japanese soldiers fell in waves as the heavy .30 caliber rounds tore through flesh and bone. Those who made it across the sandbar encountered 37mm anti-tank guns loaded with canister rounds, essentially giant shotgun shells that turned men into shredded meat. The attack continued for hours. Wave after wave of Japanese soldiers charged into the machine gun fire. Some made it to the Marine positions and engaged in hand-to-hand combat. Marines fought with rifles, knives, fists, and anything available, but the defensive preparations held. The interlocking fields of fire prevented any Japanese breakthrough. As dawn approached, Colonel Ichiki's attack had completely stalled. More than 800 of his men lay dead or dying on the sandbar and in the shallow water. Daybreak brought no relief for the surviving Japanese. General Van de Grift ordered a counterattack using elements of the 1st Battalion, 1st Marines. 5 M3 Stuart light tanks crossed the sandbar and began systematically hunting down the Japanese soldiers who had taken cover in the coconut groves. War correspondent Richard Tregiscus, watching from a Marine position, described the scene. It was fascinating to see them bustling amongst the trees, pivoting, turning, spitting sheets of yellow flame. We had not realized there were so many Japanese in the grove. Group after group were flushed out and shot down by the tank's canister shells. By midday on August 21st, the Battle of the Tenaru was over. Of the 917 Japanese soldiers who had landed at Taivu Point, approximately 800 were dead. Approximately 128 survivors, mostly from support units that had remained near the landing site, melted into the jungle. They would send a radio message to the 17th Army headquarters reporting the disaster. Among the dead was Colonel Ichiki himself, though accounts differ on how he died. The official Japanese version claimed he burned his regimental colors and committed ritual suicide. Some witnesses insisted he died leading a final charge. Marine casualties were approximately 40 killed and wounded. The psychological impact on the surviving Japanese soldiers was devastating. Captured documents and post-war accounts revealed the shock of learning that an entire regiment had been annihilated in a single night. The Americans had not fought the way Japanese doctrine predicted. They did not panic under a night attack. They did not break when charged by screaming warriors. Instead, they had waited in prepared positions, allowed the Japanese to enter killing zones, and systematically destroyed them with concentrated firepower. The most devastating revelation came from examining the captured equipment and assessing the battlefield. The Americans possessed a level of material wealth that Japanese intelligence had completely failed to comprehend. The Browning machine guns never jammed, never overheated beyond their design capacity, and never failed from poor maintenance or inadequate spare parts. Every Marine seemed to carry more ammunition than an entire Japanese squad. The artillery support that Marines could call upon exceeded anything the Japanese could deploy, and the coordination between infantry, artillery, and even naval gunfire from ships offshore represented an integrated system of destruction that Japanese forces had never encountered. In late October, the Japanese mounted their largest offensive of the campaign. General Hyakutake himself came to Guadalcanal to personally command the operation. He brought elements of the 2nd Division, including experienced troops from China. The plan called for coordinated attacks from multiple directions, with the main effort coming from the south through dense jungle, similar to the Bloody Ridge approach. This time, however, Japanese forces would have more men, better coordination, and artillery support that had finally been delivered via destroyers. The offensive began on October 23rd with a preliminary attack from the west. 9 Japanese tanks, a rare sight on Guadalcanal because of the difficulty of transporting them, led an assault across the Methodical River. American defenders, including elements of the newly arrived 164th Infantry Regiment from the Americal Division, were ready. Anti-tank guns, artillery, and even an M3 Stuart tank knocked out all 9 Japanese tanks in quick succession. The attack collapsed with heavy casualties. The main assault came on the night of October 24th to 25th. Approximately 5,600 Japanese troops under Major General Yumio Nasu attacked from the south, hoping to break through the American lines south of Henderson Field. They faced the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, under Lieutenant Colonel Louis Chesty Puller, reinforced by elements of the 164th Infantry Regiment. The fighting that night became legendary in Marine Corps history. Japanese attacks came in waves throughout the night. Individual breakthroughs were sealed by immediate counterattacks. Machine gunners fired until their weapons failed, then grabbed rifles and continued fighting. Artillery from the 11th Marines fired danger-close missions that landed within yards of Marine positions. Offshore, the battleship USS Washington stood by, ready to provide naval gunfire support if called upon. At one critical moment, only a single Marine battalion stood between the Japanese forces and Henderson Field, but they did not break. Sergeant John Basilone, who had distinguished himself at Bloody Ridge, again became critical to the defense. When ammunition ran low for his machine gun section, Basilone personally carried ammunition through enemy fire to keep his guns operational. He repaired damaged machine guns under fire. When one gun position was overrun, he grabbed a .45 pistol and led a counterattack that restored the line. By dawn on October 25th, the Japanese offensive had failed. General Nasu was dead, killed by machine gun fire during one of the night attacks. More than 2,000 Japanese soldiers died in the attempt to break through. American casualties were several hundred killed and wounded, severe, but sustainable. October 1942 also saw major naval engagements that decisively shifted the balance of power around Guadalcanal. The naval battle of Guadalcanal, fought over 4 days from November 12th through 15th, saw some of the most intense surface combat in naval history. In a confused nighttime melee on November 13th, American cruisers and destroyers engaged a Japanese bombardment force that included the battleships Hai and Kirishima. Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan and Rear Admiral Norman Scott, the only 2 American flag officers killed in World War II surface engagements, died in the fighting. The Americans lost 2 light cruisers and 4 destroyers. 3 more destroyers were damaged, but the Japanese lost the battleship Hai, disabled in the night action and sunk by aircraft the following day. More importantly, the bombardment mission failed. Henderson Field remained operational. On the night of November 14th to 15th, the battleship Kirishima attempted another bombardment but was intercepted by the USS Washington and the USS South Dakota. In a devastating display of American radar-directed gunnery, the Washington put 9 16-inch shells into Kirishima at ranges where Japanese lookouts could barely see their target. Kirishima sank with a heavy loss of life. Perhaps most significantly, American aircraft and surface ships destroyed a Japanese convoy attempting to land the 38th Division with heavy equipment. Of 11 transport ships, only 4 reached Guadalcanal, and these were destroyed by aircraft and artillery before they could fully unload. Japanese casualties from the convoy exceeded 5,000 men. This was the last serious attempt to reinforce Guadalcanal with a large, properly equipped ground force. For the Japanese troops already on the island, November marked the beginning of the end. They had expected reinforcement and resupply. Instead, they learned that the naval battles had failed, that the convoys were destroyed, and that no more help was coming. Rations were reduced again. Already starving men were told to survive on even less. Medical supplies that had been critically short became non-existent. The sick and wounded filled makeshift field hospitals where doctors could do nothing except watch men die. Captured Japanese diaries from this period painted a picture of a slow collapse. Entries described rice rations reduced to 1 ball per day, disease spreading everywhere, bodies being burned when soldiers had the strength, the realization that no more supplies were coming, men eating grass and bark, deaths from poisonous plants, and the deterioration of soldiers into desperate, starving shadows. December brought the final reckoning. Japanese command at Rabaul made the decision to evacuate Guadalcanal. They could not admit defeat publicly, but privately they recognized that continuing the operation meant the complete destruction of the 17th Army. Approximately 11,000 Japanese soldiers remained on the island, down from a peak strength of 36,000. Of those 11,000, perhaps 7,000 were fit enough to walk. The rest were sick, wounded, or so weakened by starvation that they could barely crawl. The evacuation, designated Operation Ku, would be one of the most successful Japanese operations of the entire war. Using destroyer runs similar to the Tokyo Express, Japanese naval forces extracted 10,652 men over 3 nights in early February 1943. It was a remarkable achievement under difficult circumstances, but it could not disguise the magnitude of the defeat. Japanese forces on Guadalcanal reached a peak strength of approximately 36,000 personnel. Of these, roughly 25,000 to 30,000 died, with about 14,800 killed in combat and 10,000 to 15,000 from disease and starvation. American casualties were also severe but sustainable. The Marines and Army units that fought on Guadalcanal lost approximately 1,600 killed in action, 4,200 wounded, and several thousand more temporarily disabled by tropical diseases. But American industry and manpower could replace these losses. New divisions were already training, and ships and aircraft were being produced faster than they could be lost. The strategic initiative had permanently shifted. The psychological impact of Guadalcanal on Japanese military thought cannot be overstated. For the first time, Japanese forces had been defeated in sustained ground combat. Every offensive had failed. Every attempt to apply traditional Japanese tactical doctrine had resulted in catastrophic casualties. The revelation that American forces were not only materially superior but also tactically competent, well-led, and capable of enduring terrible conditions shattered pre-war assumptions. Japanese officers who survived Guadalcanal and later wrote memoirs or were interviewed after the war consistently emphasized several themes. First, they had completely underestimated American fighting qualities. Second, the disparity in equipment and supplies was far greater than intelligence had suggested. Third, Japanese logistics were fundamentally inadequate for sustained operations against an enemy that controlled the sea and air. Fourth, spiritual power and tactical skill were insufficient against systematic disadvantages in firepower and resources. Post-war accounts from Japanese veterans revealed a consistent assessment. They had believed they were superior warriors. They trained harder, accepted death more readily, and mastered night fighting and close combat. But on Guadalcanal, they learned that war is decided by systems. The Americans had systems for everything: systems for supply, for medical care, for artillery support, for air coordination. Every system functioned. Japanese systems failed because they were never built properly in the first place. The lessons Japanese survivors took from Guadalcanal were devastating to their pre-war military doctrine. The myth of Japanese warrior superiority had been shattered. Individual courage and tactical skill were inadequate against systematic disadvantages. Night attacks and close combat, the hallmarks of Japanese tactical success in China, failed against American defensive positions. Supply and logistics were not secondary concerns but fundamental requirements for sustained combat. Air and naval superiority determined outcomes on land. These lessons, learned in blood and starvation on Guadalcanal, should have fundamentally reformed Japanese military thinking. But Japanese military culture, built on generations of tradition and recent victories, could not easily accept such a fundamental revision. The official explanation for Guadalcanal blamed inadequate supplies, naval defeats, and the unexpected strength of American defenses. It did not acknowledge that Japanese tactical doctrine itself was flawed, that the entire conception of warfare that had served Japan well against China was obsolete against a modern industrial opponent. Guadalcanal was where Japanese troops were terrified not by American soldiers as individual fighters, though they proved formidable, but by the systematic, overwhelming, relentless application of firepower and material resources that American forces brought to every single engagement. It was a terror born not from a fear of death, which Japanese soldiers had been trained to accept, but from the realization that courage and sacrifice were meaningless against an enemy whose supplies never ran out, whose wounded received care, whose artillery never stopped firing, whose aircraft controlled the skies, and whose industrial base could replace losses faster than combat could inflict them. The transformation that began when Japanese forces first encountered American jungle warfare on Guadalcanal marked a fundamental shift in the Pacific War. From that point forward, Japanese forces would be on the defensive, fighting a losing battle against an enemy whose material advantages grew larger with each passing month. The jungle warfare of Guadalcanal became the template for future campaigns, proving that American forces could fight and win in the most difficult terrain against a determined enemy, provided they had adequate logistics, effective coordination, and overwhelming firepower.